Hey. Hello, Marcus.
Hello, David.
Hey, that's a bit more like it.
That's all right.
I had a bit of a nightmare earlier on. I knew that would happen.
That's all right. I can't start the video because it says
You've been stopped from starting the video.
stop from start. I don't mind, but
hang on. I can turn yours on probably if I work out how to use all of these things, but I'm sure that will be a walk in the park. There you go. Let's see. Let's turn your video on. Host. Change all to rename. Hold, remove. Oh, that's weird. I can't seem to click. In the more, make host engineer. Wow, okay, that's going to be a bit difficult. Oh, right, here you are. Allow panelists there. I've got a ticker box. Try now.
yeah, that looks like it's working.
Wow, that was difficult. That would have been really, really quite problematic.
Is that clear? Is it all clear working?
Yes.
Yeah, good. It is quite stressful. I do a conference one, and the panic sets in very quickly if it's not working, doesn't it?
That's exactly it. I was like, okay, things are not happening properly. So let's see. Chat, right, okay. That's a panel, right? Okay, yeah. Right. Okay. So I suppose, what time is it? 28. Yeah, I just had a couple of questions in. That's good. So I was going to suggest perhaps we turn the video off, and I'll get ready to do the initial. If you turn yours off,
yeah,
I'll just wait to get some people to actually join first.
yeah, no worries.
Good evening, everyone. This is to welcome you to our first webinar, well, our second webinar with Marcus, who will talk to us about the second phase contamination report that was published last week. And we're just going to wait 5 minutes now to see while everyone joins. Okay, thanks a lot. So I think we have a few attendees now, and I was going to say, if Marcus wants to switch on his camera and unmute himself, then perhaps we can start the meeting. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, is that clear? Everyone can hear me, hopefully. Let me know, David, if it's not clear or it doesn't pick up anything. Good evening. I just thought it'd be helpful to run through the findings of the stage 2 contamination assessment following the Grenfell fire, and also some associated correspondence that we've had with the Ministry of Housing since November, really, when I got involved with the Residents Association. So I'll just run through a quick agenda, and the first thing is the update since the question and answer we had in November of 2020. Following that, I sent over the review of the stage 1 works that we were picking up on some points that seemed to be pertinent in terms of the interests of the Residents Association, and some technical comments as well. But overall, we were trying to seek a sort of a satisfactory conclusion to the legacy, this aspect of the Grenfell legacy, which is really some form of localized remediation, or that's how it seemed to be at the time. So that was the review that went in January, and following that there was some correspondence back and forth between myself and the Grenfell Tower Victims Unit of the Ministry of Housing, and they were relaying some of the scientific advisory group's comments as well, and that was quite constructive, and it has led to possibility that there may be some offer of, or some opportunity rather, that we can get some voluntary remediation done, which wouldn't be particularly onerous in terms of how general remediation of contaminated land sites is. It probably would just be a thorough cleanup of property and a replacement of shallow soils and landscaping areas within a predefined area around the tower. That area is obviously would be very difficult in a way to define, but I think the information that's already been gathered by the consultants acting for the government, AECOM, and I gather from David some other ongoing aspects of the post-fire, that there could be some logic to where you would draw that red line. Maybe it was evidence of visual fragments, debris and dust and soot falling, and that was where you draw your sort of affected area boundary. So the correspondence we've had back and forth is actually on the Lancaster West website, and they've got all the letters back and forth there, I think maybe except the latest one. So if you want to have a look at those and then let David know if there's any queries, I can follow up on that. But it does tie into the point at the end of the stage 2 works, which might be the voluntary remediation aspect. So in terms of the stage 2 works now, the government have issued the AECOM report and a non-technical summary, which is on the website, and it also has all the technical appendices. It also has a government or Ministry of Housing sort of, I think it is, summary of the summary. So because the non-technical summary by AECOM is still quite technical, and there's a sort of non-technical version of it as well. You can summarize the findings of that work relatively easily. It's the overall, initially what they did is why they did it. Well, that the stage 2 investigation, they quote, was designed to resolve remaining uncertainty from stage 1 through targeted investigation in the areas identified by stage 1. So it was more in depth. There was more targeted, although it did extend out to about 5 kilometers from the tower. So there was a big area covered. It did involve, it was like stage 1, it was vastly focused on soil, but in this time they did do some analysis of fruit and veg, and the outcomes of it, or what was involved, was a significant amount of soil testing. I mean, David and myself and members of the resident association were on site at some points when they did it, and the investigation collected 475 soil samples, so it was substantial, and 35 samples of homegrown fruit and veg. The analysis was also very in depth. There was different analysis applied to different samples, but the most substantial one involved a vast range of contaminants, which would include things that could have come off the fire, fire effluent chemicals. And as part of this work, they wanted to develop a more site-specific element to the risk assessment. That was, some site-specific aspects were incorporated before, particularly when they did, I think it was a Wainfleet Square risk assessment. But in this one, they've taken into account the fruit and veg, but also other forms of testing like bioaccessibility, which is a way of informing how much of the contaminant in the soil can actually make its way into the human body through a simulated test of the conditions of the human gut. So in that sense, the testing of the soil didn't really leave any stone unturned. The reason they did it was obviously to further inform their categorization of the site under the legislation that we're acting under, and people refer to the legislation as Part 2A. I think that's an abbreviation of the Contaminated Land Law, but it is based on a 4-category test, and category 4 is the lowest risk, new build planning, no problem at all. Category 1 is big problem, regulatory intervention is inevitable. And the vast majority of this site, in terms of site, we're referring to all of the areas they've tested, they've come into category 4, which means that they consider them suitable for use. There's no serious issues in the soil that they're concerned about. There are a couple of exceptions to that. I mean, that was broadly the finding of the first stage, so we shouldn't be overly surprised about that. But there are a couple of exceptions to that, and that is they found the metal lead it's a heavy, we're all familiar with lead. It's a common contaminant and difficult to affiliate with the fire in two areas, Treadgold House and Avondale Park Gardens, where some additional investigations going to be recommended, but that's going to be taken forward by the Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and that's as opposed to the government or the ministry. That's not unusual. I mean, contaminated land is typically the function of the local environmental health department in the district council, borough council. It's only been exceptional in this instance to date that it's been taken forward by the multi-agency partnership and a central government sort of team, project team. But it's unlikely, it's almost impossible to link the contamination of those two areas, the lead primarily, to the fire. They don't necessarily rule out that some of the contamination they have picked up in some of the samples is associated with the fire, but they've made the references to background contamination, i.e. what's in most urban areas in the UK, or particularly London or Manchester or places like that, or baseline, as in terms of what was there before the fire and what's there now. They're both reasonable assumptions, and the fact that we're talking about lead is probably not of huge interest to people who are interested in what was left over from the fire, because it probably doesn't come from there. I mean, David's familiar, and there was quite a lot of work done in the stage 1 report about site investigations done in the area surrounding the tower, which predated it, and they picked up quite a lot of lead as well. So that's not, but it's not really something to be concerned about in general for your area. It's just the nature of the soil in urban areas in the UK, and that's probably to do with vehicles and industrial emissions in the past. So the key findings really are that there's not really an obvious impact in soil from the fire. They don't see that the levels of risk associated with the fire warrant any further intervention, which might seem sort of a bit disappointing in one sense, but in another sense encouraging maybe. But I think we need to go back to the beginning, and this was the point that we picked up on in the review that I sent them, and it's a broader discussion about the law that's being implemented here, and it's not just focused on this site, and that's that the objective of the stage 1, the primary objective, was to identify the nature and potential extent of soil contamination resulting from the debris, soot and ash fallout from the fire. So it's quite a key sentence, that it's the identify the nature and potential extent of soil contamination resulting from the debris, soot and ash, but it's not analysing the debris, soot and ash itself. So if you had if some of the ground surface or even internal in the houses and the flats was covered in a dust and a soot and a debris that we've seen on the fire, and it's still there in some areas, that itself has not been analysed as part of these works, either stage 1 or stage 2. So the whole thing is based on soil and what could have come out of those materials into the soil and then be picked up in the analysis. So that is kind of the key thing it boils down to. The law that we're working to here is based on soil. So in a way, you can't necessarily criticize that against them. But I did raise this at the beginning and in a web-based seminar with them, that what about all the debris and the dust and all the that's as much of a concern, if not more so, than what's actually in the soil. I think most people would be a bit surprised maybe if it had all leached out and allowed itself to become ingrained into the soil. But that's a key point, and it does leave a lot of well, maybe not uncertainty, but because they've tried to address that, but it leaves the investigation slightly short of the conclusion that you might hope for. But that does lead itself on something a bit more positive, and that's that those two areas of investigation are going to go on anyway. I mean, I think David might know a bit more than that about me. They might move forward even since the stage 2 work in the end of June, or when it was issued, I think. But there might be, or I've probably through the local borough, that a recommendation that some form of voluntary mediation might be offered to residents, maybe within a certain buffer of the tower, but they do seem a bit more open to that now. And the last letter from the ministry also, and David's seen it, and it's I think that's the one on the website. It does sound like that's a possibility. So although we don't know exactly what that would involve in terms of the specification, how thorough it would be, or which properties it would apply to, for those living in close proximity to the fire, whose properties were sort of covered in the debris and dust, you would certainly expect it to include those, and any green areas, even little verges or raised beds and things like that in close proximity to the fire, those also, I think you'd have to say. There has been some sort of ad hoc remediation done since the fire, but it's not really remediation. It was more sort of putting some soil on top of the existing flower beds, I believe, and that's what I saw inside. It wasn't really formal, so it would need to be a bit more than that, but it wouldn't be particularly onerous. And obviously, if that offer was made, I would urge everybody to take it up. But we'd obviously want to work out what the exact specification and to which properties it would apply to. So I think that brings us maybe up to, I don't just want to go on about the technicalities, but if anybody wants to raise a question, I'll be more than happy to answer it. There's one here in the box.
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, well, we had a few questions, but I'll start with one from Andrea Newton.
Yeah.
And she's asking, hi, Marcus. Sorry I joined a few minutes late. Is there a schedule of your tour? Our soil was replaced in the kitchen garden at Talbot Grove House, and I've been veg ever since. 1, we do not know how deep this went. Can we discuss this? 2, do you have any scope to look into the contaminants in our homes? I know of residents near the tower that have skin changes within months of contact with fire debris.
Yeah, there's quite a lot there, Andrea. I can try and answer that. I should add on the last point, and that does touch on something we has come up before, and that's for those concerned about the toxicology, the long-term toxicology of anything that was inhaled or consumed at the time of the fire. I can only urge you to go to the GP and the NHS support that's sort of been discussed previously, because it's not my area. I can't really add anything to that or provide any qualified comment. But hopefully you can answer the other 2 points. Yeah, in terms of the talk, I wanted to just go through the correspondence since stage 1, but I can go through any more of this if you have any specific queries, just put them up, that's fine. The correspondence with the ministry, stage 2 works, why they did it, what was involved, where did they test, and what the summary findings were. And we're now on to we just discussed the possibility of voluntary mediation now to the Q&A. But if you if you want me to go back from those bits, please do post it. I don't just want to go into technicalities unless somebody wants to listen, but that's fine. In terms of the fruit and veg, that was analysed in the stage 2 report, and it formed part of the site-specific detailed risk assessment, where they've looked at soil contamination next to the fruit and veg that's growing in it. I think they did the testing in about August 2020, just before they did the soil analysis. And there isn't, although they did pick up some contaminants in the fruit and veg, it didn't in terms of the exposure on the whole, it didn't put it outside of the sort of safe category that they put the whole site into, or the majority of the site. So it wasn't of grave concern, and it doesn't, from looking at the data, it doesn't seem to tally up particularly that the level of contamination versus in the soil versus the fruit, the veg. it might not be that proportional. You know, it's sort of some vegetables probably are grown in more contaminated soil and it doesn't affect them. So although that's in the report, don't think it'll raise any concerns with you on the fruit and veg consumption side of it. But if you want to email me or call me, or please let David know, and I'll you know, he can give you my contact details. I'll go through the bit in the report that they're actually looking at and which of the samples was closest to you that would be of most interest. In terms of the contaminants in the houses, yeah, this was one of the key concerns at the time, and we looked into it as part of the, well, I know that David's already looked into it, but when I got involved, we looked into what was done in the January review I sent that's on the website, but it wasn't very thorough, and there were terms like wash up and brush up sort of, and it wasn't the full, you know, industrial decontamination of the property that you might hope for, especially when, well, Michelle at the beginning was describing to me that it happened in her flat, and then it happened again because obviously it was summer and everybody's windows and everything were open, and they couldn't go back to their properties for an extended period. So it does seem to be something that wasn't fully resolved, and it could have been more easily at the time, but it forms part of what we're seeking as in terms of the remediation. I know that you'll say, well, it's several years past, and that's true, but there is the issue of the tower itself, and it's still a source of dust. So once the wrapping, assuming the wrapping comes off at some point and the tower is at least partially brought down, you might encounter it again. We might have the dust deposition again. So we would ideally want to take that into account as well. But I do think, or we have put it in writing, that the pursuit of cleaning of property and land is what we're really seeking. So.
Thanks, Marcus. And just to remind people, if you want to ask any questions, there's a Q&A button that you can press to fill in and send the questions to us, so I can ask them to Marcus. And I've got another question that's been sent in by email, and it says, some of us suffered health problems because of the toxins from Grenfell. What can be done to help us? We have the right to know exactly what we were exposed to. Tests done around 2 and 4 years ago after the fire are all a bit too late. What we need is second tests. So this is from Agnes, and she's basically asking for querying that why the results that Anastec produced immediately after the fire are so different from the sets of results we've got now.
Yeah.
And she's asking what could be done with the toxins. I mean, I know that's probably out of your wheelhouse, but it'd be interesting to know what you think this soil testing has found and how it ties in with the Anastec tests.
Yeah, there was some. It was quite odd that how that came about, because some of the criticisms that I raised in the January review of the AECOM, or not really AECOM work, but the scope that they were given, was just that Anastec looked at the debris, the soot, the sort of the actual material that fell off the tower and was deposited as a result of the fire. And obviously that did pick up contaminants. But that has been largely separated from the soil investigation. Now, to take a strict interpretation of the law, the law that the contamination assessment is done under is soil-based. So it's not necessarily wrong of them to ignore all of that, but it does highlight that this is an exceptional case, and you kind of need to accept there's a degree of uncertainty, because if you're looking at soil data, you're only looking at a fraction of the problem. When people are saying we're concerned about the debris and dust and soot that fell at the time, and some of it's still there, and that's not really being accounted for, even though, like you say, Anastec did test that much of that, and obviously it doesn't look good on the lab results. I mean, there's you wouldn't expect it to. There are contaminants in that. But it's something else to add, that the contaminated land framework, there are exceptions to this, but it is largely based on a chronic risk, a lifetime of exposure. So it does, a lot of assumptions within it do assume that you're going to spend your whole life on the site. You eat a huge amount of homegrown vegetables, and you have a very low level, but it's a chronic exposure over a lifetime. Whereas we're not really talking about that. That scenario doesn't apply particularly well to what we're actually concerned about here. So it's a difficult issue, but we did raise that, and we did try and push them on that, but because I didn't want it to be framed as a sort of soil-based question and then you get a soil-based answer, but there's a little bit more at play. So but I can't do, like I said, with the toxicology, and I know people are concerned about that. I think we've spoken, Agnes, before about that, but that is the domain of your GP and your NHS. It's not something I can advise on. But in terms of the dust and the debris and the soot and the analysis that anaesthetic undertook, it would seem sensible to absorb that into the assessment at the end of this, just to take account for the uncertainty that is the non-soil fraction of the pollution, if you like. And maybe bearing in mind that the AECOM don't have the delegated power to make the decision as to what they do about the land under this law. There's only one organisation that can do that, and that is the Borough Council. That is their statutory function in law. So they may well, and if we keep pushing it, they may well take account of that. But like I said, we are still pushing for forms of voluntary mediation, and that would include indoors. That's what we have pushed for. So hopefully that does come to fruition.
I would just to say, Marcus, we had a comment from Andrea, and she's saying that AECOM have no capacity or instruction to test for contamination in homes. And I'd say that I spoke to them about that in the summer, and they also said that they wouldn't test home contaminants because they wouldn't be able to determine now 4 years afterwards whether it had been contaminated with anything. And they were quite, they said that's not really in the scope to do anything above the soil, because they were looking at just testing the soil. Do you think the way, from what's been tested for, that if there were long-lasting contaminants from the tower, they would have been found by this survey? Do you think it was thorough enough? And do you think it, say, if the contaminants, rather than spreading a plume, as I know they looked for in the first part of the inspection, if they had been deposited in clumps, because, say, with the debris that fell from the tower, do you think they would have found that in this investigation, this second phase?
I think, we saw them do it, David. The testing was, in terms of soil testing, was very thorough. The work was done to a very high standard. It's very shallow, which is what you would hope for. So it should be right on the surface. If it's made its way into the soil, I'd be pretty confident saying that the testing that they've done would have picked it up, because the analysis they've undertaken is it's expensive, but it's a very vast range of analysis. They're types of things that are very difficult to test for, you don't normally test for, and you would hope that it would have been picked up in soil. I think the question is, if it remains as a form of debris on the surface or in certain areas, like people's in the roof of buildings and things like that, or even just on the surface of the land. I think that would probably be my concern. And it does seem, if you were to take an analogy of when you do an investigation of an old landfill site, under this law, you have a similar problem, in that you're investigating soil, but the stuff you're investigating is only part soil. So you really should take some account of the uncertainty. But I agree, if AECOM weren't told to do that, if that wasn't as part of their scope, it would be difficult to quantify in terms of the actual risk assessment. I think the angle I would come at it, and I was trying to explain to them that I would come at it, is to look, the remediation that we're talking about here isn't actually that onerous or expensive. I mean, we're not drilling deep down into the ground. We're not taking huge amounts of earth away. We're actually talking about a relatively shallow surface strip of soil and the cleaning up the top and inside properties within a buffer of however you want to work that out from the tower. So given that that's the solution, or a solution that could work potentially with a bit of refinement to the specification, is it really is it really cost effective and beneficial to continue pushing the investigation further and further and further, which this will be substantially expensive, when we could just say, well, let's just assume there is a bit of a problem and try and fix it. Particularly given that the tower is still there and may represent a source of contamination again in the future at some point. So if it did that, then all of the soil analysis would be sort of compromised anyway, you would think, or at least in close proximity. But I do think and I put this in writing to them, there's a key benefit that the AECOM work should provide, and that's, they must have been worried that the contamination just goes on and on and on into the whole of North Kensington and beyond. But I think that they've shown that by comparing the soil analysis from the plume orientation and the non-plume orientation over a large area, there isn't really any correlation, or there doesn't, it's marginal. So you could draw a red line around the area affected. It wouldn't be that big. It would be, you could probably make that a stab at that quite easily based on people's eyewitness accounts of what they saw on the night. And that would probably form the basis of the area that we're looking at. So I think that there is a valuable output of that they don't have to worry about an enormous area. But I do think that we need to focus in on some form of remediation for those more worst affected. And it sounds like they could be coming around to that. I think, David, you've had some dialogue that maybe suggests that as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Well, I believe that certainly with the land that is contaminated around Treadgold, where the lead contamination is there, they're talking about that. And they're thinking of doing some other work as well, I think, on the back of that, because it seems to make sense to do it all as one piece. I think I can't put words in their mouths, but I say that I got the impression that they accepted that people weren't happy with that they wanted at least the soil to be changed or something to be done to make things better. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier on, when you talked about the tower being coming down or being deconstructed, I think as they refer to it. I just wondered, do you think that poses a significant possibility of further contamination of the area? Because I know there were some asbestos fibres found in the soil around the walkways, I believe, in the report. So that's obviously, I know asbestos can be found naturally, but I think that's probably quite likely to have come from the fire in some way, shape, and that is one of the reasons I'd want there to be some sort of remediation. But also, do you think there could be more of that released by the deconstruction of the tower, or the final removal of the tower?
Yeah, I mean, asbestos is looked at quite closely in stage 1 and 2, and so are man-made fibres in general. But I think, again, it does kind of boil down to uncertainty, and anybody can't give you an exact answer of what the risk of redeposition is after the fire comes down, or the tower comes down, or it partially comes down, or is sort of refurbed in any way, then you have to assume that it could happen. And I think there is a pretty strong possibility that there would be a significant redeposition of dust once that process started. I think I remember Michelle saying it was still depositing considerable amounts of dust after the fire before it got wrapped. So we do kind of have a benchmark that it probably would be an issue. And also it's a very tight area, as you know, although it's, you know, there's the big buildings, the actual area that occupies the tower is small. It's tight roads, and it will be difficult to get plants like trucks and plant and equipment in there. So it would make sense that when you do it in one go, you do the sort of the groundworks at the same time. That would make it logical and make it more practical. But yeah, so the answer is, could it cause more deposition? I think it certainly could. Whether it would affect soil itself, I don't know from what we've seen. But it could present I would think, a considerable source of dust and debris, and you know, there's concern about what's in that. So it would seem sensible that that's going to add to the problem, I would think. I think there's one from Andrea here on the side, David. Do you want to read that?
That was the question you answered earlier, and there's Andrew talked about the wind blowing debris into people's. If you see in the chat there, she talked about large lumps of debris blowing in, and the wind blowing debris through the windows. I know that they have finally said that they're going to offer toxicology tests to people, which is what people ask for blood toxicology. So they still haven't answered how you're supposed to arrange for one of these toxicology tests, because the enhanced health checks, or sorry, the tests they offered after about a year or 2 years of pressure were basically just the sort of tests you get when you're about 50 and you blow, with the addition of blowing into a spirometer. So there is some movement on that, but I know it's not your field, but do you know much about the toxins that Anna Steck talked about in the report? I'm sure you must have studied it for this, and the kind of effects, because I know she talked sometimes about the effects and how they could linger in people's bodies and blood and soft tissues for a long time after the fire. And I think that's one of the anxieties that people are getting as well, is that the environment needs to be cleaned properly, but also what they may have ingested on the night.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can read that comment as well. I mean, the point I think Andrew has made there is that it is unprecedented, and just applying a conventional, although it's a very thorough, but still a very conventional contamination assessment to it is a bit one-dimensional. But my toxicological knowledge, my understanding of toxicity, and is based on published information, which underpins all of the risk assessment work, and it's the same information that AECOM have looked in, and they have challenged and researched additional toxicological data where they feel it's necessary to supplement their risk assessment. So it's not something that a contaminated land professional could go into, because we're not sort of accredited or qualified to make a comment, even if we really did have a view on it. But it does often come up, particularly in Part 2A assessments, which is what this is, because you're tying in contamination to public health, whereas most of the time contamination is tied into new developments and planning. But it often gets very difficult and diffuse to actually pin down conclusive answers, because generally they need such huge populations to determine outcomes. So I think you just have to keep badgering them about that. And like David said, you need to get a bit beyond the sort of the standard health checks type stuff and a bit more specialist. But it's the difficulty, and I've said this quite since the beginning, is that you kind of have three professions here. You have the contaminated land profession, you have the fire specialist, the fire deposition specialist, particularly like Anna Steck, and then you have the the health effects, and there isn't really one person, or maybe Anastasia would be closest to it, but there isn't really one person that sits in the middle of all that and can give you a conclusive answer on where all of it meets, which does explain why you'd have to have a multi-agency partnership to take it forward. But at the moment, and what we're trying to push against is that you have a conclusion based on soil when we're not just concerned about soil. But I do think we're making some progress there, so we'll just have to keep going. But on the health effects side, from that one-off incident, sort of one-off event, yeah, it does remain the realm of public health, I'm afraid. There's not much more I can add to that.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Well, I can't see any more questions at the moment. And thank you for your summary of the report. I think what we'll do is we'll post this for our residents to look at. And I think also if people have got questions they'd like to ask or that come to them afterwards, or they think about, I think you can email us and we'll be happy to pass them on to you. And maybe also when there's been more time for people to sort of absorb the findings and what they're saying and what would possible results be, maybe even revisit this and have a sort of question and answer session. But thank you very much for all the work you did with this and for helping us on the 2 phases of the report. And I think I'm going to wrap up the meeting tonight. So thanks to everyone who attended. And
just one more thing, just before I go.
Yeah,
I probably didn't cover this enough, but I do. If it comes to fruition that an offer of voluntary mediation is sort of put to the resident association, or however it's worked out, we would want to work out what we sort of want in that specification. So that's probably the next step, really, I think. Sort of what, because at the moment we're being quite vague, but before we commit to it, we want to make sure everybody's happy with what it actually is going to look like.
Would you be able to sort of outline something more detailed that we could actually? So I think maybe the next stage will be to write to the MHCLG and the council and request some sort of proper remediation and give them an outline of what we wanted from the remediation, how it should be done. Yeah,
we could do that. Maybe get on the front foot, we'll do it.
Yeah, because I know they're planning to do remediation for Treadgold and I presume Avondale Park Gardens, which are the 2 areas that have lead pollution, historic lead pollution. But I think it would be good to be proactive on that and ask for, this is what we want and this is where we want it.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who came tonight, and we'll let you know by newsletter and on the website any more developments on the contamination. Okay, thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.